what I think is quite depressing for me is not the fact that you don't have a big audience, but the fact that academic cardiac surgery is slowly disappearing, and probably this is an example of what I mean. For some reason, since I was a newly qualified doctor, I was very interested in doing research. And probably the person who influenced me most was this individual who was actually the professor of cardiology, where I first started my training in Wales. And when I went to see him and I said, and I wanted to do some basic research, he said, the best way is to try to identify a problem which you face every day in clinical practice and use basic scientists to understand the mechanism. And if you're lucky, then you may even be able to take back those changes into your clinical practice. The other individual who influenced actually my academic career was the guy who trained me as a cardiac surgeon. And I remember when I went to see him and I said, "Sir," that's what we used to call people, "I would like to be involved in some cardiac surgery." He gave me something which I've very much kept for the last 25 years. He said, "You can't be involved. If you want to do research, you have to be committed." And he said, "Do you know the difference between committed and involved? Think of a plate of ham and eggs. The hen is involved, the pig is committed." And this is probably why it's difficult to have people who are genuinely interested in doing academic cardiac surgery or academic surgery in general, because it's a very committing and very involved job. Having said all of this, what do you go about, how do you go about if you want to write a grant which applies to basic science but also to anything really? The first thing is you need to have a good idea of what is scientifically called a working hypothesis. And this is what I usually say to my own trainees. Some may come to me and say, "Professor, I would like to look at some aspect of, for example, cardiopulmonary bypass." And the advice I usually give is go and look at the literature, because you may find that somebody has already done it. And I usually show these slides by saying from 1996 to 2000, there were more than 10,000 papers on cardiopulmonary bypass. So it's very likely that your idea is being at least looked by somebody else. So the risk is to rediscover the hot water. Now, once you've done, obviously, all your background work and your idea is feasible, the question is, how do I go by if this involves basic science? I'm always been a great believer in basic science because as surgeons, we're not very good at looking at mechanism. So I always told them basic science is really the way to change clinical practice. Now, usually in whatever institute you are, there will be somebody who is interested in the same areas you want to research. So that would be my advice. Go and talk to these people who are generally very receptive for two reasons. The first is they don't usually have access to patients, let alone body parts. So if you say you'll be able to provide biopsies of various tissues, blood samples, and clinical data, you will find them very, very willing to help you. But the main question is, and again, this is what I say to my junior people, forget that you are a cardiac surgeon. Cardiac surgeons are affected by two syndromes. One is delusion. They think, I'm a cardiac surgeon, by the way. We think we are more important than we are, and denial, we're not very good at looking at the evidence. So I say, by the fact that you have a degree in medicine and the basic scientist only got a PhD according to you doesn't qualify you as being in charge of the research, let alone trying to take all the benefit of it. Usually as clinician we go to say, can you help me, can you do this assay, and then I will write the paper with my name first, of course. One other reason why you need the basic scientist is basic science nowadays is not for amateur any longer. It's a very complicated thing which require knowledge and facility. I often put up this example, right? This is a study which is ongoing actually in my institution, where we're looking at cyanotic children and the effect of reperfusion following reoxygenation of these kids. And we're looking at gene expression. You end up looking at 300 gene expression, and then you're trying to identify the good and the bad one. Now, no cardiac surgeon understands any of this. There's no question about that. You need a basic scientist which can guide you through all of these. Otherwise, you don't have a chance. So now you got your working hypothesis, you got your team of basic scientists, and the senior basic scientists will have some technicians and some other people who can also do the working around. As I say, you got a team, but don't think that you're the driver. You're probably one of these other guys. So use a little bit of humility. And once you've done that, my advice is go and talk to two people. One is some senior people in your department who've done this probably for many years, so they know all the pitfalls. But also go and talk to a statistician or an epidemiology. And why is that? Because the main mistakes that is generally made is in terms of planning the study. Now, a few years ago, there was an editorial in The Lancet in the UK where surgery was described as a comic opera, and I'm inclined to agree with that. And I'll give you a very simple example. Quite often, somebody came to me and said, I got a fantastic idea. I want to prove whether this will reduce mortality. And I say, okay, but what is the mortality, for example, in coronary surgery? I say, oh, it's 2%, maybe 3%. Okay, you want to reduce it to what, 50% to 1.5? Have you got any idea what the sample size is, meaning the number of patients we need in order to achieve that 50% reduction? And 9 out of 10 times the answer is not appropriate. They don't realize that a study of this nature will probably require between 12 and 15,000 patients, so nobody's ever going to do it. And all you need to do, and I don't want to be critical because after all we're trying to educate people, including ourselves, all you need is to look at some of the abstract, even from this conference, where there are randomized studies with 60 or 70 patients. It doesn't matter what answer comes out, it's completely meaningless. Now, there are other ways by which you can use basic science rather than doing a big randomized study which may require 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, and that is usually by using what I call biomarkers, or markers which can give you an idea whether your treatment has got some benefit, and then you can extend it into a much larger clinical study. And this is another example of what we do in my institution. This is actually a double-blind prospective randomized study on patients who have had a recent anterior MI, which is identified by MRI, and we do coronary surgery plus or minus stem cell. It's a double-blind because the surgeon is provided with a little syringe. He's got no idea whether there is serum from the patient or serum plus the cell. But in this case, what you're looking at, your primary endpoint are, for example, is there a reduction in the MI scar, in wall thickness, and improving cardiac function. So when you use these criteria as a primary outcome, we know you're going to need a sample size of 60 patients. This won't answer all the questions, but it will answer some of the questions which will tell you whether that treatment is beneficial, and then you can go to a different level, which may be a randomized study, perhaps a multi-center randomized study. Now, what I say at the end of all of this is actually probably the most important advice I can give to everybody. Are you sure you're doing this because you genuinely believe in trying to understand the mechanism of what you do every day in clinical practice, or this is simply because you need to put another box, tick another box in your CV? Unfortunately, there is an awful lot of research done which involve waste of money, waste of time, and it produced paper which, quite honestly, are not worth the paper they are written on. Unfortunately, we are living in a kind of society now, particularly for our trainees, where to show them they've done some research, they've written some paper, is very important for their progression, regardless to a certain extent of the quality. So once you got all of this, working hypothesis, background, plan of investigation. You have to balance all of these. And I'll try to give you some ideas how you should do that. And of course, you have to identify who you pitch in your grant to. In the United Kingdom, we're very fortunate. We got a lot of institutions like the British Heart Foundation, which every year give 100 million entirely for research. The National Institute for Health Research, which is just awarded 3 weeks ago, the equivalent of £800 million, of which 11 to us. So there are a lot of opportunity, which I think are quite unique in Europe, to do some serious research. But of course, those bodies are very, very selective in choosing the people to whom they give the money and the project to give the money. So just trying to summarize in the last 2 or 3 minutes, you need to have a strategy. Writing a grant is like writing a business plan, is like being a salesman. You have to convince the people who are going to read it that you got something to sell, something good. You have to have some key feature. It has to bring some benefit. It has to be a priority, because if you want to study something which affects 0.1 of the population, probably you won't find anybody who's prepared to fund it. And of course, it has to fit in what is called the portfolio of that particular charity. If you go to the British Heart Foundation, or for example, the National Institute of Health Research, and you say you want to do a study involving animal, they will not fund it, because their remit is clinical research, and so forth. So you need to know who you send in your application to. And then you have to write the whole thing, of course. And you have to demonstrate that you got it all laid out according to what are the guidelines. But probably the most important things is this one. It has to be clear enough for somebody, if you are a cardiac surgeon, for somebody who is not a cardiac surgeon to understand what you're actually trying to achieve. A lot of these committees are made of people, perhaps there may be one cardiac surgeon if you're lucky, are made of people like epidemiologists, statisticians, and other disciplines who may not understand the very close ins and outs of cardiac surgery, but they will read through a grant immediately. They'll understand whether the question you are trying to answer is relevant, whether it's well formulated, the methodology and everything else. And I'm afraid you got only one chance, because generally they will not give you a second chance if you get it wrong. And as I said, the research has to be something which is very relevant. You are proposing something which ultimately is going to improve, if not mortality, at least morbidity. You got a clear plan of action, an aim, an objective, and also you can demonstrate, and there is the ability to deliver this research. And here we go back to the basic scientist that was alluding before, because those are the people who got the skill, they got a track record, and the facility to deliver your project. And of course, these are just some final pieces of advice, like the study design must address a specific question. Your budget, if you ask for an awful lot of money, which you cannot justify, you will not get the money. And also you have to demonstrate, and you are very organized in the way you think, you are thinking for the execution of this project, particularly in terms of timetable and who is in charge and who is accountable for all of this. And of course, you do all of this, you send your grant, and then you have to wait, and you may fail, which we all have. In the United Kingdom, the success rate for the body charity I show you is less than 1 in 4. So don't think that you send the first grant and immediately you will be given an awful lot of money to do your project. But at the same time, to be in research requires dedication, commitment, and perseverance. So there is no question, in my view, and this is what I've done really for the last 20-odd years, then the future of cardiac surgery has to be innovation. And this is, which is a cartoon, which is more than 20 years old, actually, of pieces of tissues going from the operating theater and to the laboratory, is in my institution every day's practice. Is happening. Almost every patient is entering some kind of study, whether it's a clinical study or we use as I said, body parts for the purpose of research. Of course, what I call the surgical investigator is a difficult path, and probably the demonstration, and I don't know in the rest of Europe, but certainly in the United Kingdom, we are in serious trouble because there isn't a genuine interest in pursuing an academic career. As I said, if you want to be a surgical investigator of an academic, this is the suspension bridge in Bristol, but I often say you have to be a bridge in between two ends. One is the basic science and the other one is clinical medicine. And this is what I usually give to my trainees. You must be a bridge tender, channeling knowledge from biological science to the patient bedside and back again, and you will trace your origin from both ends of the bridge. You are thus described as a bastard, because one, at the end, the basic scientists, they say you're a bit of an amateur, but worse, your colleagues, clinicians, they think you don't spend enough time in the operating theater when you're not very good at what you're doing. So this is, in a way, the story of my life. Thank you for listening to me.